Hi, I'm Vivek Shreya, and you're listening to Glass Bookshop Radio.
Welcome to Glass Bookshop Radio. I'm your host, Jason Purcell, and today we're going to hear from Vivek Shreya and Juliana Neufeld, who recently celebrated the 10th birthday of their book, God Loves Hair, with a special anniversary edition published by Arsenal Pulp Press. In 2010, Vivek Shreya self-published her first book, God Loves Hair, a collection of short stories that follow a tender, intelligent, and curious child who navigates the complex realms of gender creativity, queerness, brownness, religion, and belonging. This 10th anniversary edition, published in hardcover for the first time, includes a foreword by award-winning YA writer Cherie Demeline, who's the author of The Marrow Thieves, as well as a new preface, a new story, and new illustrations by Juliana Neufeld. In this episode, you'll hear selections from Vivek and Juliana's launch event, interspersed with a few questions from me. And we'll finish off the episode with a reading from God Loves Hair. First, let's meet the players behind this amazing book. Vivek Shreya is an artist whose body of work crosses the boundaries of music, literature, visual art, theater, and film. Her best-selling book, I'm Afraid of Men, was heralded by Vanity Fair as cultural rocket fuel, and her album, with Queer Songbook Orchestra, Part-Time Woman, was nominated for the Polaris Music Prize. She is one half of the music duo Two Attached, and the founder of the publishing imprint VS Books. A 6-time Lambda Literary Award finalist, Vivek was a Pride Toronto Grand Marshal, was featured on the Globe and Mail's Best Dressed list, and has received honors from the Writers' Trust of Canada and the Publishing Triangle. She's a director on the board of the Tegan and Sarah Foundation, an assistant professor of creative writing at the University of Calgary, and is currently adapting her debut play, How to Fail as a Pop Star, into a television pilot. Juliana Neufeld is a Toronto-based children's book illustrator and artist, known for her work on Treasure Hunters, the best-selling middle grade series by James Patterson, as well as her collaborations with noted Canadian multidisciplinary artist Vivek Shreya. Maybe you heard of her. Juliana's work is inspired by picture book art of the 1950s, our connection to nature, and small moments of humor and resiliency in everyday life. Before we talk with Vivek, here's a clip from the launch to give you a sense of her artistic journey so far and how God Loves Hair came to be.
So I started my artistic journey as a musician back almost like 18, 19 years ago. And after about 7 years of trying to make it as a pop star and not quite being successful, I started to feel the joke I always make. I don't know if Mean Girls is like too old of a reference, but I often have felt like my music career was like the word fetch. And at some point I needed to like quit trying to make fetch, aka my music career happen. And so I felt really brokenhearted, but I also felt compelled to continue to share my story or to be creative. And I had just finished reading this incredible book. I don't know how many of you have read Stone Butch Blues by Leslie Feinberg. But I read it on the plane and I bawled the entire time. And I found myself thinking about like what my life would have been like had I found Stone Butch Blues when I was 16 or 17. And I think this started to inspire this idea of maybe sharing my own story. And so as the story goes, I went into my closet. Literally, my office was in my closet. And I wrote 2 pages and I came out and I announced to my friends, I've written a book. And they were like, it's a page, it's not a book, but there is potential. Go back into that closet and finish your book. And so, after being brokenhearted by chasing like the infamous record deal in the music industry, I didn't want to make the same mistake with books. And so I was like, you know what? Fuck it. I apologize to the kids that are listening. I am going to self-publish. I don't want my success to be tied to like getting institutional approval. And so in 2010, 10 years ago, I self-published God Loves Hair, and it's been such an incredible journey. I worked with an illustrator who we'll be chatting with shortly, And basically, self-publishing, I feel like really gave me, I often joke with Sonera Arsenal, actually. I'm like, I feel like all artists should have to self-publish because it really taught me what it was like to not only be a writer, but to also be a publisher, to be my own booking agent, to be my own publicist and promoter. It really taught me from the bottom up, so to speak, about the publishing industry. And 4 years after God Loves Hair had come out, and I actually self-published a second edition, and it sold about 2,000 copies in 3 years. Arsenal Pulp Press, amazing press in Vancouver, reached out and were like, would you like to do a third edition with us? And I said, hell yes. And this is the third edition. And now, 6 years later, or 10 years since the beginning of my journey, we're here with the special 10-year anniversary edition.
Now, let's talk with Vivek. Hi, Vivek. How are you doing?
I'm good. How are you, Jason?
I am doing very well. It's so great to have you on the podcast today to talk about God Loves Hair, your first book. So thank you so much for being here.
Oh, thanks for having me.
So during your launch event, you told us how God Loves Hair came to you as an artist kind of at the heels of failed pop stardom with so much more to create and so much more to share. And you also cited one piece of inspiration, which is Leslie Feinberg's Stone Butch Blues, a text that you said you wish you had access to as a teenager. And I was wondering if you could tell us more about the genesis of the project, maybe from a nuts and bolts perspective, like how it felt to sit down and try to write a book that maybe you wish you could have read earlier in your life.
Well, the funny thing about it is I didn't sit down to write a book. I don't think ever, when you talk to people and you ask them like what's on their bucket list, I feel like most people, I mean, your bucket list, for instance, is to publish a book.
Fingers crossed, if anyone's listening.
You can hire me as your agent. But, I think most people, it's like, I'm guessing on like the top 10 list of like bucket lists of all time, writing a book is one of them. And for me, it's just never been a goal, which sounds like very ungrateful. I'm, super grateful to be a writer and to be a published writer. But this is all to say that like when I sat down, I never sat down to be like, I'm going to write a book right now. I think I was just, like you said so eloquently, I think I, had realized that my music career wasn't going to happen, but I still felt like this desire to be creative. And I started writing, like really, they started off as like diary entries, like, or journal entries about this idea of gender being socially constructed. So the first story in God Loves Hair is about how my parents didn't cut my hair for 2 years because of a promise they made to a god in India. And without getting into it too much, for the first 2 years of my life, I was mistaken as a girl. And so I've often joked, like, I wonder how much like me being mistaken as a girl for 2 years of my life, quote unquote mistaken, has resulted in the person that I've turned out to be, and the gender that I live as. And so that was sort of what I was exploring in the writing. And I loved this idea of God Loves Hair, just like as like a kind of like working title, because the god that my hair was promised to in India, people will go to this temple and shave their head off as a way to like show just how much they don't care about their beauty and how much they want to please God. So anyways, without getting into too much, that's sort of where it started, was just like me wanting to explore this idea of being mistaken as a girl for 2 years. And it was only in sort of like sharing some of these with friends where they were sort of like, oh, I think you might have something here. I think other people might want to hear your story in the way that you appreciated hearing Leslie Feinberg's story and reading Leslie Feinberg's story. And it sort of went from there.
Okay, so this is interesting then, because I wanted to talk to you about form, and to talk to you about how you landed on stories being the way that you want to kind of explore this theme and this topic. You just said it kind of started off as diary entries or stories to friends. And I'm wondering now, as a maybe more seasoned writer than you were then, how you see kind of these discrete snapshots allowing you to explore and take on these really quite like heavy and large and expansive topics.
I mean, I think that as a artist in general, I'm drawn to short forms, and I think really I can blame music for that as someone who loves pop music. It's so much about that limitation of 3 minutes. How much can you say within like a particular structure? And certainly you can say more in writing, but I think if you look at the spines of most of my books, or even like the fact that I make short films, like I'm really drawn to like being able to like get in there, say something like meaningful, impactful, and as accessible as possible, and then getting out. And I think that for me, to answer your question more specifically, I think that it just makes sense in a lot of ways when you think about the fact that I was coming out of songwriting into short stories, because ostensibly they're all each kind of like a song in their own way. Like they're also like very, very, very short stories, right? Like, I mean, some people might call it even microfiction. So, I think that I was just, really drawn to assembling a kind of portrait of my experience in relation to gender and sexuality, but that was sort of fragmented, and short story really allowed me to do that. And I don't know, I think it's such a wonderful form, especially when it's done well. Not to plug somebody else right now, but the author that I published last year, Tam Matangi, she her book of short stories, it's interesting to me because like it really reminded me of how much the form of short stories can be so impactful, especially if you're able to be creative with the form and to actually convey what you want to say in the form. So yeah.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I just want to give the title of Taya Matangi's book, which is Shut Up, You're Pretty, in case people want to go check that out, because it is an exceptional collection of stories.
What a great book.
Oh my God, it is so good. And that was, for people who don't know, it's also the first book that you published with VS Imprints. So
yeah.
VS Books Imprint, sorry.
Yeah, VS Books.
Yeah, so people should definitely check that out, as well as God Loves Hair. But you used the word portrait when you talked about these short forms, and I'm really interested that you did that, because each of these stories is illustrated, and I think there's something to the fact that even though these are quite discrete stories, like very short, as you said, I mean, you can open up an entire world into them, and using that word portrait kind of gestures toward the illustrations. And you had Juliana Neufeld. To get 10 years ago, you worked together on this book. You've come together again on the 10th anniversary. Did you know from the start that you wanted these stories to be illustrated?
Yes. So once the book started evolving, the original conception, once I'd written 3 pages and was like, oh, it's a book. And my friends were like, no, it's not a book. It's 3 pages, but maybe it will be a book. I was like, it's going to be a children's book, because the first stories, I almost wrote the book chronologically. So, the first story I think probably was God Loves Hair, or Lipstick or Dress Up, like one of those early stories. And so because I started with childhood, I imagined the book was going to be a children's book of some kind. And so I did want it to be illustrated. And part of it was tied to this idea of representation and, wanting to create the kind of like children's book that like I had never seen growing up. And so I approached Juliana almost instantly after I decided to move in this direction. But as the book sort of grew, I realized the way that a child voice was limiting the book and what I wanted to say in the book if I just sort of stayed in childland. And now looking back, it's kind of bizarre to even think of the book as a children's book. But what I love about it is that it does still, there is something very precious about it. There is something ornate about it in the way that children's books are precious and ornate. So it kind of, I feel like it still has those qualities about children's books that, make them, precious in that way. But, in the end, that's not what the book ended up being.
Right. I think there's really something to the way that, if you revisit a book that you loved as a child, it really kind of illuminates things in your adult life in interesting ways. And there might be something to, as an adult, looking back on your childhood and writing that. And even if it's not explicitly a children's book or a book that's meant to be read by children, I mean, addressing those things. We all have a childhood and something worth addressing. And not to get too psychoanalytic here, but why don't we take a minute and tune in to some of your conversation with Juliana?
Let's start with the personal.
Yes.
Do you remember how we met?
I don't remember the specific experience. I want to say it may have been at like a Humpty Bump at Gladstone. Am I right? Yes. those were so many of my like formative queer experiences and meeting people. So it's like I had the feeling, yeah, amazing.
Yeah, no, I feel like I met you on the dance floor of not Humpty Bump. What was the other one? Big Pimpin',
Big Primpin',
Big
yeah.
Primpin' at Stone's Place.
Yeah.
And I was like very shy. And someone, I think you had mentioned in passing that you were like, were you doing the artwork for Brooklyn Social Scene?
Yeah. I did the cover for Brendan Canning, one of his albums at that time.
Yeah, and I remember like flagging that and then going home at like 2 a.m. being drunk and like looking you up and being like, this person sounds incredible. And then years later, when I emerged from the closet with the book, well, not that long actually. I feel like maybe a year after I met you, I approached you and I was like, hey, would you like to do this thing with me? And what was your first thought when you got that message? Were you like, I don't know?
I was such a newbie. I was so fresh. I didn't have a lot of illustration experience. So I was honestly really excited to have something like an actual book to dig into. And I felt really honored too, because you were bringing these like, very personal stories about your childhood. And that's such a vulnerable, place to be in and to offer that collaboration felt really special. Like even at that time, I understood that, it was an honor to do it. I was so new. I knew nothing. I was so lucky that you saw that in me and had the faith. And it's just been such a cool thing that we're still collaborating 10 years later.
Know. Yeah, I mean, just for those of you that don't know, clearly there's a new cover for the new edition. And Juliana also did a couple new illustrations. Maybe I'll ask you one more question before you ask me a question. So I'm curious what it was like for you to revisit the 10-year anniversary edition and like do new illustrations for a text, which even stylistically, like I follow you on Instagram, I'm a huge fan, obviously, and your style has just evolved so much and you've done so much since there. So I'm just curious, what was it like to like revisit your style and the text and sort of like think about like new illustrations?
For anyone who's made work and has to like look back on their old work, it's easy to see like the problems or see how you've grown, I guess is maybe a more positive way of putting it. So there was a moment of like a growing pains of like, how do I reconcile, the style in which I used to work and what I do now? And like, how do I kind of honor, the way I was working then, but sort of bring more of myself as the artist I am now into it. And so that was a really fun challenge. And I think I did it. I think there was a way sort of where they came together. Yeah. It is a strange thing, isn't it? Always looking back. I mean, for you too as well, like looking at the first thing you make and sort of seeing it, for what it is. But
totally. Sometimes I feel like God Loves Hair is like almost like the template for me, and like I'm always sort of like trying to build from it or build off of it. And I mean, it was definitely interesting watching your illustrations for like evolve for the new stories and thinking about like how similarly my writing has evolved. And anyways, I'm talking so much. Do you have a question for me?
Totally. I guess over the last few years, several years of making work, I've like really come to appreciate and admire the bravery and sort of the inherent vulnerability in work that artists make that is personal or specific to them. And like with God Loves Hair, it's such a beautiful example. All the work you do actually is that it leaves such room for connection, I find, between the audience and the artist. But the flip side is that there is the potential for rejection. And I guess I'm curious, like 10 years ago, how did you kind of brave that? And also like maybe more generally now that you have connected with a larger audience, like how do you deal with that fear of rejection, or has that sort of gone away for the most part?
It never goes away. But I mean, it's interesting. I think that like music had just broken me so hard. Like I was just like, that was the thing I wanted so bad. I wanted to be successful and seen as a musician. And when I got to 28, 29 and I realized that wasn't going to happen, I was so crushed that it was almost like anything else was like, it was almost like I was free in a way to do something else. And so, with God Loves Hair, I remember just like having zero ambitions, being like, I don't know what I'm doing here. I just have this genuine desire to create something new, to tell this story. And Yeah, I was. I think, to be honest, my biggest stress, I mean, this is such an unsexy answer, but because of the style of self-publishing I did, I don't know how many of you are like interested in self-publishing or have self-published, but I went with an actual printer. Shout out to my designer, Michelle Campos Castillo, who like hooked me up with a printer, but like it was actually economically cheaper to print 1,000 copies over 500 copies. Like the difference in price between 500 and 1,000 was $500, which again, if you do the math, is actually economically better. But then you have 1,000 books. So it wasn't print on demand that I did. And so I literally we had a spare bathroom in my place, and we just stacked like 1,000 books in this bathtub. And again, I wasn't plugged into the literary world. And so like every book I sold was like chip by chip, piece by piece. Like it was just like, I think in terms of Rejection, it was like, there was no industry to me. I had no understanding of like what the Gillers were, or any of that. It was more just like, am I going to sell 1,000 copies? Yeah. So, I think and I do think in some ways that's what has changed, is like now that I am in the industry and I'm more entrenched, I do have an understanding of what success looks like in the industry, right? I do have an understanding what those benchmarks are, whether it's being a bestseller or, like I said, a Heather's pick or whatever. And so, and I think with every project, there's always like this pressure that we place on ourselves as artists to like reach the next benchmark. And so in some ways the Rejection is like almost harder now because I'm less innocent, if that makes sense.
Sure, totally.
Yeah. So I wanted to ask you, thanks for that question.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you, so, I mean, you touched upon this a little bit, but I was like curious if there was an illustration in this book where when you looked back at it 10 years from when you created it, you were like, you know what, this is still, I wouldn't touch a thing on this illustration. It's still perfect to me. Did you have that kind of experience of like one of the illustrations in the book that felt like this is peak Juliana still?
I think, yeah, I was contemplating that. And I think, regardless of stylistic devices or how it was drawn, I think the illustrations that I feel the most connected to, I still feel stand the test of time, kind of got closest to the emotion, I think, of the story. So there are a few of them. I think Gaylord was one that I'm going to
try and pull this up while you talk. So this is
sure, yeah.
Gaylord.
That I still feel has some of that emotion.
Yes.
And then Pervert also is one that I felt like it's pretty bold, and I think it's just an image that I enjoy. I'm trying not to, you look at it with too critical an eye, because I can probably take anything apart.
No, I mean this one. I mean, it's interesting. I actually framed this one for the longest time. Like there's something about like the queer brown body that is seen as freak or pervert, and to just like have it owned on the forehead, to me, I just thought was like, always I thought it was such a beautiful image. And to me, it just also felt like such a reclamation of the word pervert, because so often queerness is seen as perverted. So yeah, I'm still a huge fan of this one.
I'm so glad to hear that. Yeah. Well, that actually, you know what? I'm going to just jump into my question, because
okay, great.
It's basically the same thing. I guess I know that like when I'm illustrating a story, I'm trying to take the author's experience, I'm extrapolating what they find is important, but then I'm kind of filling in the gaps with what I know and what is inherently sort of like what I understand about something. And sometimes that means things get lost in translation, but hopefully more often than not, it kind of merges into something new, or at least something that kind of gets closest to the experience. And I'm just curious, because I never asked you, like, is there an illustration that you felt like, yeah, that kind of is what I was picturing in my head, or does look like, when I think back on that moment? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I have to say, like, so I wrote most of the book before I had approached you, or half the book, but I remember one of the most exciting things about working with you on the collaboration of the book was that you would send me an illustration, and it was so good that it like kind of fired up my competitive spirit, where I'm like, oh, I see what you're doing. And then I felt like I had to like amp up the writing, because I wanted to like match how good your illustrations were. So some of my favorites are God Lives in India. There's just something so beautiful about the starkness of this image, and just, like this is something I used to do as a kid, was like, during recess, because I had no friends, like I would literally find a tree and like tie a ribbon around it and meditate. And like when I saw this, I was like, yeah, that's that's what was going on there. And I remember just feeling just so moved by that. There was also something about Girls Are Dangerous. So this like moment, this sort of like intimate moment with my dad. And it's like one of the first times that like my dad really comes up as a character, and like the sort of like tension between me and my dad that I thought was like really beautiful. I mean, God, there's so many here. I'll tell you one of my ultimate favorites.
Thank you for this, by the way.
Bed Humper.
Oh, yeah.
Bed Humper. It's just, first of all, I remember being like, are you really going to name the second story in your self-published book Bed Humper? And I was like, yes.
To all of your titles.
Yes, I'm going to. I just feel again, I feel like queer sexuality, we're so robbed of our sexuality. And again, it's that whole notion of our sexuality being wrong or perverted. And it just feels so important to like own that, like to just be like, actually, queer kids have desire. We do. Sorry. And so,
and at young ages too. Yeah.
Pardon?
Yeah, and at a young age too.
Well, exactly. Like I remember like humping my bed since I was like 5 years old, like that's just what was going on. And there was just something, it's just so tender. There's just such a tenderness about it. I love the spotlight. I just, again, like, if I can share a quick anecdote, I don't know if you remember one of the first times we met to talk about the book, I brought you like a stack of references and they were all like Hindu iconography. And I remember being like, my idea for this book is for you to take Hindu iconography and like modernize it. So, there's a story called Lipstick, and instead of Krishna with the butter, let's do Krishna with lipstick. And you actually pushed back. You're like, actually, I think one of the things about this book that's so great is that it's like contemporary. Like it's got that mythology, but it's like also got the pop culture. And you really pushed to like find that balance. And I'm so, so grateful. And this is where I think collaboration can be so rewarding, because as an artist, you're like, I have this vision. But, when you work with someone else who has a new perspective, they bring in something that you couldn't have seen. And I'm so grateful that we didn't do what I wanted to do. Do you remember that at all?
A little bit, yeah. Well, I definitely remember all the references you brought me. But you know what? It's funny. Some of my favorite pieces are the iconography now. So to your point, I kind of love that the book is like a fusion of you at that age and what was popular at that time, which are totally my cultural references as well. But then you also have like a deeper, more historical reference that were important to you. And I feel like it kind of grounds the book in a nice way. And it also made the poster I made super fun to make. I like enjoyed, illustrating all that stuff so much. So
yeah. So shout out to the limited edition special poster that you created, which is exclusively available at Glass Bookshop right now, and they'll ship to all the way around North America, all the way around, slightly south of us. If you're interested, you can see it on our Instagrams. Okay, so maybe I'll ask you one more question, and then we'll take audience questions. So maybe let's go back to the personal, and this doesn't really have anything to do with the book, but I'm just so curious, like I've sort of shared where I was in my artistic journey and like who I was at that time, but I'm so curious, like, who were you in 2009? Like, what do you remember about that time? And you're like,
was I a person? I don't know. When you think back and you're like, you're a version of yourself. And I think I was, sorry to cut you off. And just,
well, no, I was just going to say, like, do you remember anything like a highlight or like an event that happened to you during that time in 2009? Like, what was 2009 for you?
I mean, specifically, not in that year so much. I just remember I was at a sort of an exciting point in my life. Everything was ahead of me, and I was going to be so many things. And I was developing a friend group and developing a relationship with Toronto and trying to get my footing as an artist. So it was a really growing period for me too. I was also exploring my queer identity as well. And so the book was this really great opportunity for me to kind of, explore it through your own experience and get to look at it with my eyes in a different way, which I really value. Because I think you are so brave, I think, in terms of sort of tackling a lot of your queer identity. It's not bravery, but it's so much a part of your experience. And it's something that I really appreciate. And being able to kind of jump in on that and be a part of that in a different way was really important to me, I think, at that time.
I mean, to me, it was so exciting to be working with another queer artist. Like and I often talk about how collaboration is one of the ways I build friendship. And, even though you and I aren't like besties and we don't talk to each other every day, I love how every time we do reconnect over the years to like collaborate on something, you're always like, it's like time never passed in a way, which is like this really, really nice thing. Like it's always just felt like quote unquote safe to me. It's always felt nurturing. It's always felt like inspiring. So, thank you so much for that. This is just such a nice love fest.
Yes, totally love it. But I mean, I could say the exact same thing about you. I found it super easy to collaborate with you. You really honor the artists that you work with. And I felt that from the beginning with you too. So it's so amazing to kind of look back 10 years later and see that we're still developing that, and we're still working on projects, and to see your growth and my growth as well.
Exactly.
And to be able to kind of work from where we're at now is really special. I have to say, like I've done a lot of freelance. I've worked with lots of clients, and it is rare when you find that really like reciprocal, like you said, like nurturing relationships. So yeah.
So it's so great to listen to you and Juliana talk to one another about this project and about collaboration in general. Like so much of your body of work is constellated with amazing collaborations. How did it feel to pick up this project again?
Honestly, it felt really great. I mean, I said this in the chat too, but I feel like Juliana and I connect every few years through art, and it always feels like no time at all has passed. I really feel like we are friends through art, and it's a beautiful thing. And so, revisiting the text, I mean, I think it was interesting to know that there would be a new story in the book. And thinking about how she might explore that, especially as someone who I have followed her career and I've seen the way her style has changed so much. So I was sort of curious how she would be able to sort of go back in time and revisit the story. But it was really actually exciting to see how she worked because without giving too much away, that particular illustration is actually now one of the first times we actually get to see the boy's face very clearly. And there's something very special about that. Like, I think 10 years ago when we were doing the book, there was something like almost like unconsciously protective about or protected about the boy throughout the book, whether it's like in The Color Purple where his head is sort of like hidden by the hat, or even with Pervert, it's just the eyes. But we don't like ever really get a clear view of him. And I thought there was something really beautiful when I saw her image for the first time for Garden Hose, and it just kind of felt like a relief. I was like, you know what? After 10 years, you deserve to come out of the shadows, my friend. So, and then even like seeing what she did with the cover, right? Like, I felt really attached to the original cover, but we also talked about revisiting the cover, and she went with this sort of like bright color pop, sort of inspired by like Indian murals in India. Like, every wall is painted, sometimes with like giant Pepsi ads, but it's just like walls. They just really use wall space, and they're just like beautifully painted. And she sort of went with that angle, and I think it just like again gives the book a different kind of meaning and history. So yeah, it was wonderful to revisit all together.
I'm glad. And I think you've given, like, those of us who are fans of yours and readers of yours and listeners of yours, something really remarkable, because in this collaboration, you kind of see, you said you don't always stay in contact or you reconnect every few years, but you kind of see the ways in which like you've both developed so much as artists, but have managed to stay connected to one another, to your friendship through this project. I think that's, it's really amazing to see. I'm really grateful for this 10th anniversary collection.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, and during your launch, you told another story about one particularly impactful reader, which I think gestures to another type of, if not collaboration, connection that your work invites. So let's listen to that clip.
One of the strangest and best experiences I had was Farzana Doctor, who might be still here, she was organizing a reading series in Toronto called Brockton Writer Series. I don't know if you ever went. It's sort of in your neighborhood in Brockton, Juliana. And but anyways, it was rainy. It was in a church. I was reading from a book that had Bed Humper in it. Like, I was like, what am I doing here? There was 8 people there. And I was like, oh man, like, I don't know. Like, I don't know what I'm doing. And I did a reading, and, I tried, like, I always, like, whenever I go out, even if I'm sort of feeling like not 100%, I try to give my best. And After the reading, I ended up meeting somebody who was a university professor at Brock, Margot Francis, who loved the book so much that she assigned it to her first year class, which was 300 students, and then again a year later and again. And she's in a lot of ways how I ended up selling out of the book so many times, is because she just kept assigning it to her students, which was surreal to go into her class years later and see like 300 students holding your book. But also, to me, it's just such a reminder as an artist that like you just never know who's in the room. You just never know, and that's why it is so important to like always give your 100% if you can, because yeah, you just never know.
So I love this example of ways that people that you don't even expect or even know can show up and support you in ways that legitimately have a life-changing impact. Another example is with the foreword of the new edition by Cherie Dimelin. So let's listen to that story from your launch event.
How Cherie Dimelin came to write the preface. So Cherie is a fantastic YA author. If you haven't read The Marrow Thieves, you should. I think that, it won a Governor General Award. It's won a huge amount of prizes. It was a Canada Reads book. When the conversation about doing a new edition came up, Brian had suggested that it would be great to get a foreword. And, I was trying to think about like who's someone I could reach out to. And it was actually my partner and my friend Trish who actually were like, what about Cherie? And, she's so busy and she's so huge that I was just like, there's no chance in hell that she's going to have time for this project. But she actually messaged me right away. And I kept like, I don't know if you ever do this thing, Juliana, where you're just like, it's okay if you say no. Like, I understand you're busy. Like, totally fine. Like, I was really trying to give her an out. Yeah, and she was like, no, happy to do it. Just let me know. And she delivered it on deadline and everything. So, again, goes to show you, never hurts to ask.
10 years into your literary career, what does it mean or how does it feel to not only have writers like Cherie Dimelin writing on your work, but to be their peer, like to have made such a valuable contribution in just 10 years?
I mean, it's pretty surreal, to be honest. Like, even thinking about everything that I've done beyond books, right? So in book world, I've published 8 books in 10 years. But at the same time, in the past 10 years, I have, formed a band and put out a couple of albums with my brother. I made a record with like Queer Songbook Orchestra. I started making short films. Like my 30s have just been like just hugely active. And sometimes I wonder like what I was doing in my 20s when I just made an album every 4 years. Like were you just sitting around? Like what was going on there?
Don't say that to me, especially.
But it's to me, it's just really exciting because I think that we are in a culture that tends to value youth, and there is this idea. I mean, one of the things I've made jokes about in your 30s is that when you're in your teens, especially who I was, people would always say to me, "You're such an old soul. Like you have so much potential." And suddenly, when you hit 30, nobody says that anymore. No, nobody looks at you saying like you have a lot of potential. You just kind of are, know. But to me, it's been exciting because I think my career is sort of like an example of the ways in which actually you never know when a creative spark is going to hit. And I think so much of why my career has gone the way it has is because I spent most of my 20s unpacking trauma from like homophobia and misogyny from my teenage years. And so, I think that like, there's certainly people who've said this more eloquently than me, but I think queer and trans people, we lose time, and that our clocks are just not the same as, straight people and cis people. And so, yeah, I'm very like, if I can say without sounding like an egomaniac, I'm very proud of the past 10 years. And I think the thing I'm proudest of the most is that, I moved from being self-published or from self-publishing to now being a publisher. And I'm now able, because of the sort of like supports I have and the resources I have, I'm now able to like do that thing for others that I actually wasn't able to do myself 10 years ago. And that to me just feels like the biggest gift in the world. So yeah, it's surreal, it's exciting. And I feel like grateful. And again, if I may, I feel proud.
You absolutely may. I think you've done so much incredible work, not only for yourself, but as you say, for so many other people, and that is worth being proud of. And I know so many people, including myself, are incredibly grateful to you for all that you've done. So, uh, I guess I'll just finish off by saying congratulations on 10 years of God Loves Hair, because your work and presence in my life, and I'm sure in the lives of everyone listening, has been a tremendous gift. And I'm very excited to be celebrating this book, and I cannot wait to see what the next 10 bring.
Oh, thank you. Thanks, Jason. And I mean, I like, listen, I know this sounds corny but like it's so true. Like I really, as we're having this conversation, I find myself just like thinking about the first time that like you sort of came into my world as like someone who was talking about my work. And I think it was around Shoe of the Mountains. And
Mm-hmm.
it's weird to think that was 6 years ago. Like I've known you for 6 years now as, a supporter and like an avid supporter. So, I'm only able to do what I've been doing because I have people like you that are like champions, so thank you so much for everything that you've done for me, and certainly like other authors.
Aw, anything for you and for other authors. Um, okay, so thank you so much for spending some
Those
time with us today.
others.
Those, I don't know their names, but they're out there.
Right.
Okay, thank you so much. But before we go, let's listen to the last remaining minutes from your conversation with Juliana.
Here, Juliana, how do you approach an illustration for something like Bed Humper?
How do I approach it? Gosh, I wish I could put myself back in that exact space, but I feel like you gave me a lot of good reference, and just honestly looking at the story and reading it over and picturing what comes to mind, starting to sketch and sort of seeing it where it develops. Yeah, I don't know. Specifically for that one, I imagined it being sort of dark and having, I did imagine sort of a single light on there. So I know that was there from the beginning. Geez, I guess I do a lot of comics, but I also do a lot of like children's book illustrations. So a lot of my, inspirations are kind of classic children's book stories, but also just sort of daily life moments, to be honest. It's sort of like, the little things that you see in the street, the things that are memorable, the things I might take a photo of on my phone when I'm passing, that kind of are all sort of fodder for what comes out when I'm making something. So yeah, I would say life is the biggest one. I mean, it's probably the most cliche, but
You sound like an artist. What can you do? What can you do?
What about you? What's your take on
inspirations? I'm like really inspired by words, which is maybe the most cliche thing to say as a writer, but like even as like a musician, and it's so connected to titles too. Like the phrase "part-time woman," for instance, was like really in my mind and like really inspired me. And that's sort of like what built the song and the album that I created. Or, I'm Afraid of Men, very similar, where it's like there was something about those words together. And so there's something about like phrasing or words. And then it's always about like figuring out what medium best serves, like to get those words across. God Loves Hair, like I always knew from the beginning that like that's the name of the book. Like it was really funny working on God Loves Hair. And did you ever see that Chris Rock documentary, Good Hair?
I did, yeah.
And so he actually goes to India. I mean, without giving away too many spoilers, but like I talk about how my mom made this vow to this god in India, where like you shave your head if you want something from that god because it pleases him. And Chris Rock actually goes to that temple in India, and at some point he shouts at the camera, he's like, "You're saying God loves hair?" And I was like, and again, like I already named the book that, but like when he said it, it was just like very affirmative. I was like, yes, exactly. So
I had no idea there was that connection. I love that. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense though. Yeah, because when I think of your work too, like you work in so many different mediums, and it's so lovely to see. And I was wondering, like, is there one form that sort of do you feel like best matches what you're trying to express? I connect so much to your writing, but I also love your music, and it feels like they're all sort of part and parcel, of course, of who you are.
Oh, thanks. Yeah. I mean, for me, music will always be my first love. I think that like that's where I feel at home is like just singing. And I've definitely grown into other mediums. Like I've grown to appreciate the things that you can say in a book that you can't say in a song, or things you can say in a film that you can't say in a book. But I think music is still like my first love. How about you? Is there a specific kind of drawing or illustration or like material that you like to use? Like I know you use watercolors.
I used to do a lot of digital work, and I have sort of been entertaining that a lot more lately. But I think my heart is definitely in like pen and ink and watercolor, and Yeah, sort of hands where I can, something where I can really get my hands in it, and explore and make mistakes. And yeah, there's something really just sort of lovely about returning to that stuff. Yeah.
And now, here's Vivek Shreya reading from God Loves Hair.
Bed humper. Say your prayers. I dread this moment, having to look up at the creased picture ripped from an old calendar hanging on my wall. He sees me. It's the Lord Venkateshwara. He is the scary god, faceless except for his teeth, who steals your hair if you're bad. I whisper a sloka and then I climb into bed, turning my face to the opposite wall. I listen for silence. When it's safe, I roll onto my stomach, squeeze my worn-out baby blanket, and quietly push my body up and down against the bed. The next morning, I touch my head. Hair's still there. I know it's wrong. No one has told me, but I know it is. It has to be. It feels good. I don't even know what it's called, but I know it's wrong. One day, when my brother walks in on me, I tell him I'm exercising. I know that if I want something from God, I will have to forsake it. Dear God, if I get a Ninja Turtle blimp for Christmas, I promise not to do it for 3 weeks. I break my promise. Soon after, a night exercise ends in what feels like a short burst of pee, but almost from a different place. My hands are tingling. I turn on my night lamp for a closer look down there. White goop. I broke it. God is punishing me. I seek comfort from my mom. She is sitting on her bed sewing a button onto her sweater. I stand by the door. Mom, I have a problem. The other day, I woke up and there was this white liquid coming out of my private part. Is that normal? She looks at me. I step back. Yes, that's normal. I pause and then turn around before she changes her mind.
And that's it from Vivek Shreya on God Loves Hair. You can get signed copies of the book at glassbookshop.com, or a special commemorative bundle, which includes a gorgeous limited edition print by Juliana Neufeld. Thank you so much for listening, and don't forget to subscribe to the podcast however it is you do that, and please leave us a review. It is tremendously helpful in helping us reach new people. Big thanks to Heather Buchanan for doing that almost immediately and without prompting. You're the best. You can also find us on the socials. We're at Glass Bookshop on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook, and you can buy books from us at glassbookshop.com. We deliver free in Edmonton, St. Albert, and Sherwood Park, and we mail internationally. Tune in next time for another great episode between two writers who me and Matthew both love. I'm not going to say who, but you're going to love it. But until then, this has been Glass Bookshop Radio. Our producer is Magda Mulatu. Our artwork is by Michelle Campos Castillo. Music's by me. And we record right here in the Miskwachiwaskagan, Treaty 6, Edmonton, Alberta. Talk to you soon.